It smelled like blood. Salt, fish, blood, and the humid tang of unwashed bodies. Sentinel knew it was rust and iron, not blood. But the scent had grown so familiar that it was the first identifier his brain offered up. He didn't question how bleak his life had become if he recognized blood over metal. He already knew. It was punishingly hot, the sun beating down relentlessly. He missed his usual gear, which was calibrated to maintain ideal body temperature, no matter where Umbral sent them. For this mission, they were supposed to blend in, or at least appear less intimidating. He knew that blending in was a lost cause before they even started. Sentinel didn't blend in anywhere, let alone Mauritania. He was over 6 feet tall and built like the one-man killing machine Umbral had carved him into. Still, he and Jester would fare fine in the shipping yard. There was enough diversity there that if they kept a low profile, they'd make it through well enough. But Umbral hadn't sent just him and Jester. He reached out his hand and helped the blonde, blue-eyed, easily sunburned Aegis off the iron train, followed by his Korean hand-to-hand combat specialist, Tempest, and wondered if he was still being punished somehow. As deadly and capable as the two women were, they were going to blow Ares' cover immediately. The fact that they were all obviously armed wasn't a problem. Many of the people at the shipyard were. But armed women were rarer. Hawkeye had been left behind, both because his specialty wasn't applicable, and because he failed to be able to hold a conversation with people he'd known for years, let alone strangers. Oh well. Tempest would have come at him like a scalded cat had he brought up the concern, so he kept it to himself. It was an easy job on paper. The danger would be minimal, but he couldn't say the same for the frustrations. Maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe his usually rock-solid psyche had been scraped raw after Crater Station, and the loss that came with it. And that made him paranoid. They'd been dropped by helicopter in the town right before Noedibu, on the country's single rail line, and boarded the iron train along with a handful of merchants and traveling locals. In the dead of night, they'd gone unnoticed, but the price of a stealthy entrance into the port city had come with a cost. They all removed their goggles, wiping them on their pants before pocketing them. Iron ore glistening in the morning sun covered them. They all unraveled the scarves from their faces and shook them out, embedded ore floating through the air as they wrapped the checkered fabric around their faces once more. Sentinel swore he could feel the stuff in his lungs, and he once again longed for his gear, especially the gas mask. It almost made him laugh. For as much as Umbral had put them through, they'd managed to spoil him when it came to his loadout. This was old school work. No heads-up displays, no visual overlay maps, no thermal vision or night vision, no GPS tracking. They each had an earbud in to communicate in case they were separated, and Sentinel carried a single burner phone connected directly to Eclipse Initiative handlers. They were to call for extraction, or if there was a situation they couldn't handle on their own. But the tone had been clear. They were expected to figure it out, if at all possible. The briefing had been painfully slim on information too. The shipping depot being run out of Noedibu was Umbral property, but third-party contractors staffed it, all under the name of one of Umbral's hundreds of shell companies. These were not trained personnel, or anyone who cared about company assets outside of whether they got paid or not. All Sentinel was told was that a number of shipments had gone missing, and Ares was supposed to get to the bottom of it. It didn't make sense to him. They were an elite team, sent to handle the riskiest and most difficult jobs. Surely Umbral had people better suited to shaking down dock workers. Sentinel himself had seen some of their interrogators, or can openers, work their magic before, and it was truly something to behold. But sending Ares to do the job instead was like using a hand grenade to pick a lock. Overkill, and a waste of time and resources. But who were they to question the company? They were simply tools, after all. That kind of thinking would get him demoted to low-level infantry if spoken out loud. So he kept that to himself too. There was work to be done. As hot as the conditions already were, he was able to momentarily forget about them as he looked out over the shipping yard. Dozens of container ships lined the harbor, being loaded and unloaded with cranes. Others were in dry dock, getting their hulls repaired. Further out, the skeletal remains of cargo vessels loomed, corroded hulls groaning against the brilliantly blue tide. Some were beached on sandbars, with other, newer wrecks surrounded by smaller boats. Scrappers there to take what they could. The ship graveyard was the signature of corruption in the city, but that anything goes air was likely the reason Umbral had placed a depot there. Besides Umbral's vaguely named Eastport Maritime Logistics, a number of other smaller shipping operations, along with hundreds of fishermen, operated out of Noadibu Bay. It was buzzing and alive, totally different from the jobs they had been working lately. Sentinel was tried and tested, though. It wasn't new to him. Aegis and Jester seemed fine too. Tempest was good on the outside, but he could see her elevated energy in the small movements she made. The team spent most of their time together helmeted and anonymous, so he'd been forced to understand all of them in other ways. It was almost harder to determine what she was thinking, barefaced, her dark eyes serious as she looked ahead. It was Jester, unsurprisingly, who broke the odd silence. "Let's get this done. I'm itchy." They were all itchy. They'd ridden for hours in the open back of an iron ore car, just to arrive unobtrusively. "We weren't told this outright, but everything points to this being an inside job. We need to keep focused and break down anyone who resists. No violence unless I give the order. We don't need an uprising on our hands." "We could split 2 and 2, Jester suggested. "Make quicker work of it." "No," Aegis snapped. And everyone, even Sentinel, knew not to respond. He agreed with her anyway. The intimidation factor of all of them together would be valuable. They checked their sidearms, the only things they had been cleared to take, and Sentinel took point. He'd been right. Their presence alone was turning heads, but not nearly enough to distract most dock workers from their jobs. Some stared openly, while others looked out of the corners of their eyes, hands never leaving their current task. He knew their existence would carry through the shipyard through gossip, but he could only hope their thieves didn't catch on and flee before they found them. It would be helpful if they knew just what Umbral was moving around and what would be a target for theft, but that was wishful thinking. Umbral's portion of the shipyard was on the far right, and the infrastructure was newer than the rest. Security was posted out front, armed with various rifles, heavily muscled and overly serious. The company was walking a thin line. If everything being run under their name looked too new and important, they'd likely be robbed. But if what they were moving had any real importance, Security was non-negotiable. Now they just needed to see how easily swayed the hired guns would be. 2 of the guards moved into position, blocking the entrance to Umbral's docks. They moved with an easy self-assurance, but they were also wary. Sentinel stopped and waited, his teammates falling into a loose formation around him. The guards were clearly confused by the ragtag group of armed strangers, their hands tightening on their weapons. Sentinel spoke, voice even, calm, and authoritative. "I'm going to ask you to step aside and let us pass." The guard sneered. "I'm gonna tell you no. We've been told not to let anyone through. This is private property." Sentinel was a big man, and he used his size to his advantage, staring the guard down until he shifted uncomfortably. When he replied, he could hear the menace creeping into his own voice. "It's a good thing we have permission, then." "No one's told me about you. You'll need to wait here and talk to the dock manager." Sentinel didn't bother responding. Instead, he raised his hand, making a fist. The guard stiffened, fingers twitching on the triggers, and he heard his team shift. The guards needed to know his team was a threat. "What do you use to identify workers going in?" The guard swallowed, digging a small scanning device out of his pocket. "Chipped ID cards. The guys that run this place are strict on security. The strictest in the whole port." Umbral might have been hands-off with the depot, but their fingerprints were still all over it. Sentinel reached into the neck of his shirt and pulled out his dog tags, solid black and seemingly blank. A nearly invisible code was etched into the metal. "These should scan then. Do it." The man was sweating, and his partner had gone pale. He scanned Sentinels first, then the rest, his jaw dropping as the ranks flashed across the screen. Their identities weren't revealed, but what they were, an arm of the Eclipse initiative, was enough. "No way," he croaked. Sentinel felt the satisfaction, like the first drink of cold water, as he saw the recognition in the man's eyes. He nodded. "Good. Now step aside." They did, and Sentinel led the way in. He had the layout memorized from the briefing. It wasn't much different than the rest of the shipyard, just with heightened security and updated tech here and there. The workers behind the gate looked nearly identical to the ones outside of it, and it was clear why the company had been struggling to figure out what was going wrong. Everyone, even those that had unknowingly found themselves working under Umbrella's thumb, knew each other. They approached the main building, the structure old but well cared for. The windows were open, and a fan spun lazily in the front office. Tempest spoke, her voice low. "Something feels off, doesn't it? I don't like it." "None of us like it," Sentinel shot back. "It's bullshit, is what it is. They're not equipped to deal with people like us, and we're so overqualified that we're underqualified." Sentinel didn't reply immediately. He knew Tempest had a point. They were more than capable of taking care of a few criminals, but there was something inherently cruel about using a sledgehammer to swat a fly. Still, his team didn't have a reputation for nothing. If Umbral was sending Ares, they had their reasons. "Our orders are clear, so let's move." It wasn't the first time the team had been sent out for less than impressive tasks, but all of their nerves were raw. Loss stung like salt in the wound. They were a well-oiled machine, and when they lost a piece, the rest struggled. Sentinel couldn't blame his team. He was barely holding on too. "You got a read on it?" Tempest asked him, and he realized he had been silent for too long. Yeah, he replied, refocusing. "Let's go in." The door opened up into a spacious waiting room with a handful of plastic chairs. A desk sat in the corner, cluttered and dusty. There was a single occupant, a man sitting behind a computer and reading glasses. The picture of boredom. He looked up as the team entered, surprise registering on his face. "Welcome. Can I help you?" "We're from headquarters. We've been called to investigate the recent losses. Where's the dock manager?" The man's eyebrows raised, and he gave them a second once-over. "I'll take you to him. He's a bit busy at the moment." Sentinel gestured forward, and the man got to his feet. He was nervous, but it was better than combative. "He's been a mess lately, losing all of this product." "Has the shipping yard ever experienced anything like this before?" Aegis asked, a gentler touch. "No," the man shook his head. "Never. At least not back here, working for Eastport. Of course, there are thefts and bribes outside of here, but the safety and the consistency are why the jobs here are the most sought after in Noah Debu." "So, it's unprecedented then. Is the dock manager competent? We don't want to spend all day here." "Oh, I'm sure he'd be happy to explain it all to you," he assured, leading the way through the building and out to the docks. Sentinel's attention was focused ahead, watching the workers scatter as they noticed the Ares team coming. The dock manager, a wiry, sweaty, nervous-looking man, was standing near a small group of security guards, yelling at them. "There's no reason for the loss in production. You're all getting paid too much not to know what you're doing." "We are doing our best," the guard said between clenched teeth. "We've caught no one in the act yet." The manager let out a wordless sound of frustration, running a hand through his sweat-plastered hair. He saw Ares coming and blanched, mouth working soundlessly as they approached. He managed to compose himself before they stopped in front of him. "Who are you? And why are you here?" he asked, voice slightly strangled. "Eastport sent us to deal with this. We don't like wasting time. Tell us about your problems here, and we'll get this sorted out and be on our way." He seemed to gather himself, squaring his shoulders and straightening. "I suppose you mean the missing cargo. It's always on the manifest, and it's counted with everything else unloaded. But by the time it should make it to its destination, it's gone. That's all I know." "You said it's been going on for a while. How long has that been, exactly?" 2 months at the very least. We had a big loss the first week, but the rest have been small, I guess. Enough that they've added up. No one noticed at first." Sentinel watched as Jester peeled off from the group, not going far, but talking to a smaller group of low-level workers while he kept the manager occupied. "I've never lost anything like this before, I promise you. And my security team is top tier," he continued, voice slightly whiny. Strangely, he was tempted to believe the man. He didn't sense antagonism from the dock manager, only a sort of slimy deceit. This man wasn't robbing Umbral, but he may just have been cutting corners to line his pockets. He watched as one of the guards spoke into a radio, a dark-haired woman coming around the side of a stack of containers, watching the team intently. He frowned and continued the conversation, knowing his team would keep tabs on any suspicious activity. "Do you have a suspect?" "It could be any of them, really." He sounded flustered and looked ready to start yelling at someone again. Aegis spoke, voice as cool and steady as the breeze from the water. "How much are we talking?" 250,000 worth. Jesus. As this has happened in Fun Month? The dock manager's voice rose in pitch and volume. I'm not lying! Sentinel watched the other group again. The dark-haired woman hadn't moved from her position, and he caught the eye of a man at her shoulder. He looked away quickly. And no one knows anything. That's unbelievable. Tempest cut in. I'm telling you the truth. The dock manager's hands clenched at his sides. Sentinel tuned out their back and forth. He took in his surroundings with a careful eye. The shipping yard was in its full swing, with hundreds of employees working to get things loaded up and onto boats. But none of it was distracting enough to hide the few acting odd. Enough, he cut in, stepping forward to get Tempest and the dock manager's attention. There's a lot of eyes on us, and neither of us wants to cause a scene. I want to see your logbooks, list of employees, and the exact dates that the thefts were noticed. Of course, he managed to sputter out. The dock manager took off to retrieve his files, and Tempest sidled up next to Sentinel. She leaned close and spoke under her breath. He's gonna be useless. I don't think he's stealing, Aegis sighed. At least not cargo. Wages? Maybe. Agreed, Sentinel added. If he's not responsible, we've got a lot more work ahead of us. Jester was back at the team's side. They've got an odd setup. This is the main dock, and they have two smaller ones on the sides. One of the security guards was acting funny. I asked around, and there are a handful that flee every time I try to speak to them. Something smells here. Aegis and Tempest agreed. The manager came back then, handing over the paperwork. It was organized, in the loosest sense of the word, but Sentinel scanned it over. It didn't take him long to realize that what he was looking for wasn't there. He showed Aegis. He doesn't have a full inventory of the things missing. The dock manager, who had been watching them anxiously, cut in. A lot of the shipments come in unmarked. We're told not to ask questions. The nature of our work, you know? That didn't seem strange to him. Umbra was, of course, unusual in every sense. They operated on the edge of legality. They weren't the most upstanding of employers, so Sentinel was used to some sketchy things. The fact that this man didn't ask questions and lacked any extra curiosity about his job was probably a perk in the company's eyes. But a little insider information would have been a boon for Ares, and the fact that they'd got none from the manager was frustrating. He was done talking in circles. Take me to where the cargo was stored before it shipped out. There's no one place, the manager replied, looking frustrated. There are containers everywhere. Depending on the port of origin and destination, just take me to the biggest storage yard. The man sighed, clearly defeated, pulling a filthy handkerchief from his pocket to mop his forehead. This way, then. He motioned for them to follow, sighing heavily as he walked next to Sentinel. Eastport must have more assets than I thought to send a team of hired guns out here to harass me. It was almost enough to make him laugh. Hired guns. Just 2 weeks ago, he'd been planting his fist into the face of a genetically modified super soldier and almost getting killed in the process. You have no idea. Hired guns, indeed. Jester's grandmother had read a lot of romance novels. So many that there had been boxes of them in the basement, covers faded and wrinkled. When things got really boring, and there'd be no minor arson to commit or fireworks to set off, he'd sometimes dig one out, hoping to find something sordid. It was in those pages that he'd read about countless widows walking into the sea, desperate to assuage their grief by ending it all. He'd found the notion stupid, until he'd spent hours in Noadibu. Iron ore and sand digging into his eyeballs, nostrils, pores, and other unmentionable areas. Then he understood the pull of the water and briefly considered at least 10 times abandoning his team and walking into the open, salinic, waiting arms of the Atlantic. After all, he was grieving, wasn't he? A life, a teammate, gone. It was becoming disturbingly commonplace for them. Umbrel decided just how long they were allowed to grieve, and then they'd given another mission, a task, so below them that he had to remind himself to keep his temper. There was a bitter taste in his mouth as the sun bore down on his face, and his hands itched. There was too much to think about. There was no time. What was loss when you were a machine? Something owned, a meat bag that had been formed into a shockingly effective soldier by a company that he had turned himself over to willingly. He had been a child, overflowing with razor-sharp intelligence and the unquestionable need to destroy. Better to be a carefully crafted meat machine, aimed like a gun at an intended target, rather than a person in society, haunted by the intrusive need to watch it burn. "You good?" His head snapped to Tempest, scarf pulled down so he could see the clear line of grit that had bisected her face where she had kept part of it covered. Jester's legs had been moving, but his consciousness had been elsewhere, at the bottom of the sea, in the center of a firestorm, a cremation chamber, of somewhere 6 or so feet beneath the earth. 2 other equally disposable bodies on either side of him. "I'm fine," he told her, aloof. How in the hell did he go from physical discomfort to questions of his own mortality? "That's for when you're off the clock," he told himself. "I was just thinking about how long Sentinel would have me washing gear and cleaning guns if I stripped down and took a swim." "Extra time for blinding us, I'm sure," Tempest said. "This place is hell, isn't it?" It was, but at least they'd finally gotten somewhere a few degrees less than the surface of the sun. The dock manager had led them to an endless sprawl of shipping containers, stacked as high as possible, so close that he couldn't even see the blue sky. It had been dark and blessedly shaded from the moment he stepped foot on the concrete. "This is the largest storage area," the manager told them, sweat glistening at his hairline. "These are the shipments scheduled to go out within the next week. Ever since the first few containers were broken into, I've tried to schedule extra guard shifts, but, you know." He shrugged, one thin shoulder, looking uncomfortable. "Good workers are hard to find." "Are they?" Jester asked, patience hanging on by a thread. "Or are you running a skeleton crew on purpose?" The dock manager sputtered. "Well, of course not. I just can't get enough men." Aegis interrupted them before the manager could say any more. "We'd like to see the guard schedules. Go get them while we have a look around." It looked like he was going to argue for a second, but with Tempest giving him a hard look, he ran off. They walked through the rows slowly, looking around the area with a careful eye. There were rows upon rows of stacked containers, each one stenciled with familiar labels. Medical supplies, office equipment, laboratory, standard stuff. None of it would have been particularly interesting to thieves. It wasn't until they moved deeper into the stacks that he felt a prickle of interest. Among the scuffed, faded older containers that were constantly in use, a few stood out like new teeth in a rotten mouth. They were sleek and unmarked, the unmarred surfaces of them gleaming in the overhead sun. The locks on the doors weren't standard issue, but much thicker, with a small screen on the front of them instead of a keyhole. "Biometric locks," Aegis mused. "Interesting." Jester stepped closer, running his fingers along the surface of one. It wasn't standard steel. It felt too smooth, too cold even in this heat. When he rapped his knuckles against it, the sound was off. He crouched, inspecting where the container met the ground. No scratches from forklifts, no dust clinging to the edges like the others. Either this had been put here recently, or they were made of something that didn't hold dirt like normal metal. This isn't regular shipping container material, he muttered, pressing his palm flat against it. It sounded thick when he rapped his knuckles on it again, almost unnaturally so. If he had to blow this thing open, it'd take more than the usual breaching charges. Maybe thermite. Maybe something stronger. Unless they're stealing these things entirely intact, then they've got to be cracking them open somewhere a decent distance from the docks. Otherwise, the entire town would hear it. Sentinel came to stand next to him, reaching out to touch the container. If you had your normal gear, could you crack it? Yes, he said without hesitation. But it wouldn't be easy. Whatever is in these things, Umbral wants to keep it a secret. The question is, why would they use a public port like this, especially one run by a third party? That has nothing to do with our objectives. Sentinel's words were simple. If they had been sent for this, it would have been stated. And as things were, the mission had nothing to do with breaking into Umbral's shipments. He wanted to press further, but he held his tongue. What's next then? Aegis was scratching at her braided hair, dust drifting from it on the hot wind. Seems like they're in for hours of going over security footage. She was interrupted by a sound, low and almost inaudible in the near distance. Footsteps, but not coming from the direction the manager had departed. Instantly, every member of Ares went rigid, weapons fluidly drawn, and they all turned, pivoting towards the noise. "Show yourself!" Sentinel barked. A shadow moved between the stacked containers, and Jester's fingers hovered on the trigger. Then a man stepped out, hands held high, legs visibly shaken. It was the same guard that had scanned their tags and let them in earlier, and seeing the fear in the muscle-bound man was almost comical. Fear made him look smaller, somehow. His uniform drenched with sweat and clinging to him, eyes all sclera, pupils pinpricked with terror. "Please don't shoot," he begged. I know who you are." No one lowered their weapon, and Sentinel took a step forward. "That's so?" The guard swallowed once, and then twice, nodding. "My brother, he was recruited by the Eclipse Initiative. He told me what you guys do, what you are." Great, Jester thought. A surprise security leak. This guy's idiot brother is going to be in a world of hurt once Umbral finds out he's running his big mouth. Still, the way the guy talked about them, like some urban legend, was a nice boost to Jester's already overfed ego. He smirked. Sentinel, on the other hand, was unmoved. "And?" The guard hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before taking another cautious step forward. "I want to help you. If things go sideways here, I don't want to be caught in the crossfire." Sentinel flicked his chin toward Tempest and Aegis. "Keep an eye out for the dock manager. Don't let him back here if he shows up." They nodded and peeled off toward the distant cluster of shipping containers, leaving Sentinel and Jester alone with the trembling guard. Jester tilted his head. "What do you know?" The guard exhaled, looking around again before speaking. "Did you happen to see a woman working here? There's only two. A young one and an old one. Yes, the Major confirmed. Mid-30s, I'd say. Yes. Her. She's not just some worker. She's a lookout. A spotter for a crew that's been running a smuggling operation under the dock manager's nose. A smuggling ring. It was a boring, if expected answer. Yeah, but not how you'd think. The guard took a shaky breath. They don't steal containers from here. They push them overboard. Chester's eyes narrowed. Overboard. The guard nodded rapidly. Into the shallows, near the old derelict ships in the graveyard. They've got a system. Once a container's in the water, they tow it inside one of the rusted out hulks. It's been hollowed out, turned into a storage space. That's where everything disappears. That's why they're listed on the ship's manifest and the logs after they're unloaded. Sentinel finally lowered his weapon as the pieces started to fall into place. They're actually on the delivery ships, and someone on the smuggler crew marks them as delivered, even if they were dumped. That's why the loss isn't discovered until they reach the destination port. Do I have that right? The guard nodded. Jester groaned. The whole setup was slick, untraceable. If a shipping company's inventory numbers checked out when everything was loaded and unloaded, no one would even know the cargo was missing until it was too late. How often? Sentinel prompted. Every few weeks, the guard answered quickly. Always at night. Always when the graveyard's covered in fog. He hesitated, lowering his voice. It's been going on a lot longer than you think. They've just been getting greedy lately. Jester's eyes drifted to the unmarked containers, shining like a freshly minted coin. That, or they finally started taking something worth noticing. Sentinel took a step closer to the trembling guard, his voice low. Here's the deal. You show us exactly where the ship is, and you give me the names of every smuggler you know. In return, we make sure you don't get caught up in whatever fallout's coming to the rest of the dock workers. Relief swept over the guard's features. I don't know all of them, just a few. That's fine. Just give us who you know. Okay. He blew out a long breath. Okay. The guard glanced between them before clearing his throat. Do you think Eastport will, reward me for this? Jester couldn't help it. He barked out a short, humorless laugh. Reward you? Buddy, you'll be lucky if there's even a job left for you. Or anyone once this is over. He tilted his head. But hey, at least you'll live to see another day. That's more than I can say for some of the guys you're ratting on. The man paled, but gave a short, reluctant nod. He turned, leading them toward the edge of the dockyard. The sun beat down, baking the concrete beneath their boots, and Jester could feel sweat gathering at his collar. They found Tempest and Aegis near the entrance, the dock manager looking anxious to get past them, but unwilling to push his luck. He looked relieved to see Jester and Sentinel, which was a mistake on his end. Gentlemen, he started, holding out the timesheets they had asked for. We don't need them anymore. Sentinel wasted no time. We need a vehicle, something that can handle the sand. He paused. And a pen. A long, tense beat passed. Then, with a sharp exhale, the manager dug into his pocket and pulled out a key ring in a capless blue pen. He hesitated only a second before tossing them over. Sentinel caught them effortlessly, handing the pen and one of the unneeded timesheets to the guard to make his list. Then he tucked the keys into his pocket. Smart choice. There's an old transport buggy parked by the supply shed. The Dark Manager seemed defeated as Ares moved past him. It'll get you where you need to go. Jester let out a whistle as they reached the buggy. Man, I love how people suddenly get real cooperative when they realize who they're dealing with. They just think we're goons hired by the shipping company. Tempest countered before jerking her head towards the guard ambling in their wake. Who's this guy? Well, this guy actually knows who we are, and he's about to snitch on a significant number of his co-workers who are running a smuggling ring. Tempest grinned. We love a snitch. Love, Aegis sighed, is a strong word. Sentinel slid into the driver's seat without comment, starting the engine with a low rumble. The guard climbed into the passenger side, looking like he regretted every life choice that had led him to this moment, with both women in the back. The guard's look of regret only grew when Tempest pulled out her sidearm and aimed it at the back of his head. Insurance, she told him, in case you get cold feet. Jester hopped onto the side, gripping the frame as the vehicle lurched forward, kicking up a trail of dust as they sped toward the ship graveyard. The sun had just started its descent from the top of the sky, stretching long shadows over the abandoned hulks ahead, the rusted skeletons rising in the distance. As the sand whipped up into his wrapped face, Jester again considered the water and the idea of bones, human or nautical, eaten away by salt and time. There might be peace there, but he had work to do. The ship graveyard was an ugly place, but an interesting sort of ugly. Sun-bleached husks of ruined freighters and trawlers jutted out from the sand and sea like tombstones, their metal hulls pitted with rust. They stood skeletal and warped by time, dumped unceremoniously so their owners could avoid the cost of dealing with them once their usefulness had come to an end. Soldiers, not deemed worthy of true rest once their time was up. It struck a chord in Tempest, but less of one than it might have for the others. She was young, and her mortality was a much more distant concept. Closer as of late, but distant still. The heavy cloying smell of spilled oil joined the other offensive smells once they arrived at their destination, and their pet security guard had them park behind a mess of low scrub brush. He pointed out which ship was going to be their destination, though she could have guessed, considering the nearby sand had been hard-packed from foot and tire traffic. It was an old freighter, beached on the shore like the stranded corpse of a massive cetacean. Its bow had split open, jagged metal curling outward, the entire thing a mess of rust-streaked white and blue. There was the ghost of lettering across the side, but it was impossible to read. Its name long since eroded away. Once they were parked, Tempest holstered her gun once more, and the guard's shoulders relaxed. Oddly enough, she trusted the guy, mostly because he was so scared of them, but she wasn't taking any chances. She heard the man audibly gulp, and if she was a kinder person, she would have offered him a drink from her canteen. Almost as if on cue, Aegis took hers off her belt and handed it over. Don't put your mouth on it. Thank you, he breathed. Once he'd drunk and handed the canteen back, he seemed a bit more confident. I can't be sure, since I'm not part of the ring, but word travels. There's supposed to be a pickup after dark, so they're probably loaded up with a lot of stolen cargo right now. So they'd recover more of Umbral's property, but there were guaranteed to be people guarding the goods. Tempest grinned. So, we're looking at a live op instead of just evidence gathering. Good. This has been boring as hell. The guard licked his lips, clearly not comfortable with her enthusiasm. Just be careful. There's at least 15 smugglers in the ring. Maybe more. A snort of laughter cut through the team. Jester, of course. Oh no. 15 whole criminals? Whatever will we do? Tempest cracked her knuckles. God, I hope they put up a fight. The guard looked between them, baffled, then seemed to decide it was better not to question anything further. Sentinel jerked his chin toward the ship. Move. The approach was a wet one. After switching their sidearms from drop leg holsters to their chest rigs, Ares made their way to the ship. They kept to the side of the freighter where the sandbar dropped off into deeper water, forcing them to wade waist deep through the surf before they could reach the hull. The water was warm, heavy with silt, and the ghostly sway of seaweed clinging to them like grasping fingers. Jester gave in to the temptation and tied his scarf around his waist, holding his sidearm above the water and dunking the rest of his body, head included, under the waves, scrubbing at his face, beard, and hair before surfacing. A muscle in Sentinel's jaw worked, but he said nothing. Tempest briefly considered the possibility of doing the same, but when she heard Aegis's quiet, "Please don't," she powered ahead, reaching the ship first. The metal hull was rough with corrosion, but solid enough. She jumped, caught the edge of a broken maintenance ladder, and hauled herself up. The others followed in quick succession, moving with practiced ease. This left the guard in the water, looking both flabbergasted at the ease with which the team moved and unsure of his own fitness was going to allow him to do the same. There were enough holes in the side of it that Tempest was able to cup her hands and look into the hold, suppressing a surprised gasp at what she saw. It was exactly as the guard had described it, but the scale of the operation was still impressive. The hollowed-out cargo hold stretched into the dark, filled with stacks of stolen shipping containers. Some had been forced open, wooden crates stacked haphazardly, while others had been left locked. From what she could see, there were 2 of the shining, unmarked containers. One looked untouched, but the other looked like it had been peeled open on the side, the hole barely big enough to fit a crate out of. She waved Jester over to take her place while Sentinel and Aegis used other viewing points, and Jester sucked in a breath. I can't imagine how long it must have taken them to get that thing open. Satisfied with what he'd seen, Sentinel turned and threw the buggy keys to the shocked guard, who was still in the water. He caught them, startled, nearly dropping them into the ocean. There's your reward. Get the hell out of here and never breathe a word of this. Pretend it didn't happen. The guard hesitated before clasping the keys between his grateful hands. Yes, sir, he said, bolting as soon as the words were out of his mouth. They briefly discussed their plan. Sneak in and try to get information out of the smugglers, if possible. Incapacitate any threats if gunfire isn't present. Execute if it is. When a wave hit the side of the vessel, making the rotting hulk of it creak and moan, Sentinel used the noise to mask the sound of him kicking through the rusted hull. This widened the hole that they used to look through. One by one they filtered in, weapons held low as they assessed the situation. The sound of human voices echoed, but no figures were visible. Battery-powered lights illuminated the corners, and sunlight poured in from the open cargo door at the back, but most of the hold was dark. The stealth aspect lasted all of 10 minutes. Ares moved through the shadows, weaving between the stacks of containers, each step deliberate and nearly silent. It would have been laughably simple to execute each smuggler one by one, none of them aware of the attack before it was too late. But they needed information, and something told her that the smugglers weren't keeping extensive written records. They found their first target, leaning lazily against a stack of stolen crates, arms crossed, eyes closed. Jester moved on him like a ghost, shoving his sidearm into the man's ribs before he could react. "Not a sound," Jester whispered, sounding almost amused. "We've got some questions for you, friend." The smuggler's eyes went wide, his mouth opening in silent shock as he looked at each of them. Sentinel stepped forward, speaking quietly. "Tell us who you're working for. Full names." The man was trembling. I don't... His fight or flight kicked in, dooming him. The man ducked and ran, blindly scampering towards freedom before Jester was on him, slamming him back against the crate. The man fought like a cornered animal, biting at his captor, screaming at the top of his lungs. "Help! Help! They're here!" Jester cursed under his breath, looking a touch remorseful. Then, with cold, brutal efficiency, he snapped the man's neck with a sickening crack, dropping the twitching body to the ground. But it was too late. A chorus of angry shouts erupted from deep within the ship, footsteps pounding on the corrugated metal as they rushed towards them. "Here we go," Aegis muttered, more annoyed than anything. Tempest counted to 3, and the smugglers were on them. They flooded the part of the hold Ares was in, weapons drawn, trying to block the team in. There were around 15 of them, just like their guard had said, but less than half of them had firearms, and she'd bet that only 3/4 of those firearms worked. They were a mix of grizzled dock workers and younger men, hungry for money and power they'd never see otherwise. For a beat, neither side moved. Ares stood still, their sidearms raised, completely calm and unwavering. Machines. Umbral's vengeance. In one terrible breath, the smugglers seemed to realize that they weren't facing any ordinary intruders. But it was too late. Gunfire erupted. Tempest knew none of them had fired first. A lack of discipline wasn't in their nature. But their return fire came in an instant. Ares was forced to move fast, ducking to avoid the shots, all of them lacking the body armor they usually wore. It was exhilarating, a change from the norm. Tempest still thought the mission was an insult to their capabilities, but it was more entertaining than she had anticipated. Tempest hit the ground fast, rolling behind a shipping container as bullets sparked off rusted steel. Jester fired back. 2 shots, 2 down, while Aegis moved in flawless rhythm, dropping another with 2 precise shots to the kneecaps. Sentinel's aim was unerring, every shot a calculated kill. Tempest was a damn good shot, but she wasn't in the mood to waste bullets. She surged forward, tackling a smuggler as he reloaded, ripping his gun from his hands and slamming the stock against his temple. Then she spun, elbow connecting with another's jaw, sending teeth flying. She'd forgotten her arms were bare below her short sleeves, and one of those errant teeth sliced into her skin. The pain was dull and novel. She savored it for the rarity it was. Quickly, she dodged a blur of movement that came at her left, watching as a mountain of a man stumbled to a stop when he didn't manage to take her down like he had anticipated. The man turned to see her, lowering his worn machete, and laughed with cruel confidence. Easily 6'5" and built like a battering ram, the man sneered at her. "What in the hell is this? They send a little girl to fight us?" Tempest smiled. Somewhere to her left, Jester laughed out loud, yelling, "Moron!" Ares already had the upper hand, and the fighting slowed to a crawl as smugglers and soldiers alike stopped to watch what was unfolding. Tempest rolled her neck and flexed her fingers. Yeah, they did. The giant laughed, shaking his head. "I don't even need a blade for this." He tossed the machete aside, grinning. "I'll break you with my hands." Tempest let him charge. He was a big guy, slow and predictable. His first punch came high, wide, and easily telegraphed. She had no doubt he could knock a bull unconscious with such a punch. Unfortunately for him, she wasn't an animal, but a storm. She ducked, pivoting, and drove a knee straight into his ribs, hard enough to hear the sharp crack of breaking bone. As he fell, she drove the heel of her hand into his sternum, the plate of bone shattering as the man screamed, high-pitched and panicked. The giant stumbled, trying to catch his breath, but there was no recovery for her opponents, ever. Tempest closed the distance once more, grabbing his arms and twisting hard, wrenching his shoulder out of its socket. The second scream had barely left his throat before she dropped low, swept his legs from under him, and watched him fall like an old-growth tree, slow and tragic. When he was down, she lifted her boot and stomped it into his left kneecap. The echoing crunch silenced the rest of the horribly one-sided battle, and the giant writhed on the floor in agony. She held out her arms, cocky, victorious, and asked, "Anyone else?" It was a long silence, and then the sound of weapons being laid on the ground. One by one, the smugglers raised their hands in surrender. Sentinel sent her a withering look, which clearly read, "Too much," before he turned back to the smugglers. "On the ground. Hands behind your heads." They obeyed, of course, and Tempest inhaled slowly, adrenaline singing through her veins. Maybe the mission hadn't been such a waste after all. It was over before it ever really started, but that was preferable to Aegis. With her booted foot between the shoulder blades of a prisoner, she was already counting the hours until she could sleep away the labyrinth of her thoughts. Over the last week, she'd found herself almost painfully jealous of their rebuilt robotic teammate Exo. Mindless, efficient, incapable of higher thought. She wanted that for herself. Aegis registered the sound of Sentinel pulling out his burner phone, his deep voice reporting their success and calling for extraction. The distant cries of gulls and the rhythmic lapping of waves against the hull of the ruined ship felt far away, muffled, as if she were listening from beneath deep water. She breathed in, forcing herself to focus. The air in the cargo hold was thick with the scent of sweat and fear rolling off the remaining smugglers as they laid on the ground, hands behind their heads. Sentinel spoke in low, clipped tones into the phone, his face unreadable. Aegis couldn't hear the response from the other end, but she recognized the way his jaw tightened, the subtle shift in his stance. Bad news. Wasn't it always? When he hung up, he turned back to the team and raised a hand, fist clenched, 2 fingers extended. He cut his hand across his chest in a diagonal. A simple gesture, execute. Aegis felt cold all over. Then she felt nothing. She'd known, of course. They always cleaned up loose ends. It wasn't personal. It was just the job. Her stomach churned. It hadn't been so hard before. Gone were the days they'd allowed her to carry non-lethal rounds. She swallowed hard, gripping her sidearm. It felt heavier than usual. Or maybe she was just weaker. The smugglers had no idea. They were still quiet, obedient even, like frightened animals that hadn't yet realized the slaughterhouse door had shut behind them. Aegis considered walking away, turning her back, letting the others do it. She'd failed them so many times before, what was another one? But then Sentinel was beside her, speaking in a low murmur, just for her. If the others saw, they pretended they didn't. Aim high. She exhaled, slow and measured. A small mercy. Accessory to murder, instead of murderer. She remembered being so much younger, swearing to do no harm. The feeling of a needle sinking in a cardiac muscle. A breath. A death. Ares raised their sidearms and took aim, and when the shots rang out, she missed on purpose. The screams and panic were brief, the following silence never-ending. Aegis didn't look, holstering her weapon, and stepped over the lives they'd been paid to end. They moved through the ship in silence, sweeping the stolen cargo for anything worth flagging for recovery. Aegis let her hands go through the motions, checking labels, prying open containers, listening to the distant echo of Jester humming to himself as he worked. Keep moving. Keep vacuuming. Keep breathing. It wasn't until she reached a crate stacked just outside the open, unmarked container that something made her pause. It was at least 7 feet long and 5 feet wide. No label, but a single word scrawled in bold, angry letters. Rakshasa. The word meant nothing to her, but something about it, the stark black font, the way it stood out amongst the rest, made her shiver. Curiosity, molasses slow, raised its head. She hesitated, thought about mentioning it to Sentinel, but she was tired. So, instead, she turned away and walked back to the others. It was Umbral's problem, not theirs. Minutes later, they heard the thrum of an approaching aircraft, and they descended the ramp of the cargo, waving their arms as the chopper circled down. Another successful mission. Another day boarding a helicopter that cost enough to feed the surrounding city for an entire year, with the blood of another human being between the treads of her boots.